Thank you, dear Dr. Father, for that kind introduction. That's the term we use in German, Dr. Father. Yeah, so I'll be talking about consciousness here, there, but not everywhere, unlike panpsychism. And for background reference, Giulio and I wrote an ex-archive manuscript that you can find. The technical stuff is in this Pieleu's computational biology paper. And then a more general account is in my book, Consciousness Confession of a Romantic Reductionist. So without further ado, I used to, for many years, when I started talking about consciousness, I used to sort of have a 10-slide preamble why, as a scientist, as a natural scientist, as a physicist, and as a neurobiologist, one can reasonably talk about consciousness. In fact, why, as a scientist, one has to talk about consciousness if we want to take science seriously, particularly the claim of science that science ultimately can explain all of reality. Because the one aspect of reality that I have close acquaintance with, in fact, to adopt the languages of philosophers, the only aspect of the world that I have direct acquaintance with is my own consciousness. I know nothing about the world. The only thing I really know about the world, the only thing I have direct knowledge of is my sensations. The fact that I see, I hear, I feel, I can be angry, I can be sad, those are all different conscious states. So the most famous deduction in Western philosophical thought is René Descartes, more than 3 centuries ago. Je pense, donc je suis, later on translated cogito ergo sum. In modern language, we would say, I'm conscious, therefore I am. So the only way I know about me, about the world, about you guys, about science is because I have a movie in my head. And so if science is ultimately to try to explain everything, including dark matter and dark energy and viruses and neurons, surely it has to explain the phenomena that's at the center of each one of our existence, namely consciousness. And I think in order to do that, in order to successfully bridge what some philosophers today call the hard problem, one has to start out with experience. So rather than giving you a long definitions, is there a way to dim the lights here just for this movie, please? So in lieu of giving you lengthy definitions that typically only happens in a science once you're at the textbook writing stage, I'm showing you one of many, many illusions I could show you. And if you, is it moving? Okay, so if you just keep your eyes steady, if you just fixate, for example, the central cause, or if you fixate the cause at the bottom, then, well, you tell me, what do you see? I mean, just tell me, it's not a... rotating ball. All right, what else do you see? All right, yeah, that's true, but what else do you see? I mean, it should be pretty obvious. All right, thank you. The yellow squares disappeared. Otherwise, you should come see me afterwards if you don't see that. So here we have a very simple phenomena. The yellow squares disappear. If you really keep your eyes steady, both of them can disappear. Once you move your eyes, they make a reappearance. In fact, it's counterintuitive because the more salient you make the yellow squares, the more likely they're to disappear. So it's certainly a counterintuitive explanation. All right, so this is a simple, it came out in Nature more than a decade ago. And the thing about this that Francis Crick and I were always interested in, where's the difference in the brain between when you see the yellow square and when you don't, right? You have a particular feeling associated with it. It feels like yellow, it reminds you of lots of other yellow things you've seen before. And when you don't, the photons are still there, they still strike your retina, they still evoke retinal ganglion cells firing, but you don't perceive them anymore. And the claim is of myself and many other people that once we understand things like simple forms of consciousness, like visual consciousness, we're well on the way to understanding all of consciousness. Since the higher elaboration of consciousness, like self-consciousness, etc., are just exactly that, the elaboration upon something that's probably much more basic. So what is it that we can say today for certain about consciousness? There are many things that we can say already. People think they are likely, I mean, I constantly get, well, every day I get manuscripts from people who prefer to explain consciousness, but consciousness is now like a little bit like nuclear physics. There's a large body of data that you have that any one theory has to explain. You can't just start from scratch. So for instance, we know that consciousness is associated with certain types of complex adaptive biological systems. Not all of them. So for instance, the enteric nervous system, roughly 100 to 200 million neurons in us, down here in the gut. they don't seem to be associated with consciousness. We don't really know why, but if you have feelings down there, typically they're mediated to activity in the insula, right? If you feel nauseated or something like that. It's caused by neurons, we know this, from brain stimulation, etc., up in cortex. You have an immune system. In fact, you have several immune systems, right? You have an acquired immune system and an innate one. They respond to, in a very complex way. They have memory, right? Once you form antibodies, you can think of that as a memory. Right now, I just came yesterday from Seattle. I may well be exposed to some bug here in the Cambridge area. My immune system is busy fighting it off, but I have no conscious access to that. I don't know whether my immune system is active now or not. I don't know. Yet it's doing some very complicated tasks. So we need to ask, why is it that my immune system seems to work in this unconscious mode? We don't know. We know consciousness doesn't require behavior. Certainly in fully grown people like us. We know this because every night we go to sleep, and sometimes we wake up in the privacy of our sleep, and we have so-called dreams, which is another form of conscious states. Yet there's a central paralysis that's given out by our brain, because otherwise we would act out our dreams, which wouldn't be a good idea for our bed mates. And of course, that occasionally happens. Also, there are cataplexy and other forms of clinical cases when people are unable to move. There are, for example, the MPTP patients, the frozen addicts that were unable to move yet were fully conscious. We know, similar from the clinic, we know that consciousness doesn't require emotions, at least strong emotions. You can, for example, talk to veterans that come back from Iraq or Afghanistan, and let's say their leg's been blown off and they have sustained brain damage due to an improvised explosive device. Yet if you talk to them, they're clearly conscious. They can describe you their state. They can describe you how they're feeling, but they have this totally flat affect, right? And they're not concerned about their future. They're not concerned that their life has changed radical. So certainly the strong emotions don't seem to be necessary to support their consciousness. We know, once again, from clinic, and we know this from fMRI experiments and others, that consciousness doesn't require language, nor does it even require self-consciousness. Self-consciousness is a very elaborate form of consciousness. It's particularly well expressed in academics, particularly certain types of academics who like to write books and like to introspect endlessly. It's probably counterproductive to a certain extent. Yet through most of my daily life, when I try to introspect in the evening, when you're engaged, so I bike every day to work, when you're going at high speed through traffic, when you're climbing, when you're making love, when you're watching an engaging movie, when you're reading an engaging book. In all those cases, you're out there in the world, you're engaging with the world. When you're climbing or biking at high speed, you're very much engaged with the world, yet there's very little self-awareness, self-consciousness. Simply, you don't have time to really reflect upon yourself when you're out there engaged with the world. So there's really no evidence to suggest that aphasic people or children who can't speak yet are not conscious. We know from lots of patients, a particular beautiful patient, this guy who was a conductor, and BBC made a movie of him, who had a medial temporal lobe viral infection that knocked out his entire medial temporal lobe, a very dense amnesia. You can track him over 10 years. He has no long-term memory. He still is in love with his wife that he married 2 weeks before he had the virus infection. 10 years later, he still thinks of her as just newly married. It's very endearing. Yet absolutely, he doesn't remember anything consciously. But he's full. If you talk to him, he can tell you all about his feelings of love, how he feels vis-a-vis his wife, that he rediscovers every second, minute. It's very striking. So clearly, consciousness doesn't require long-term memory. We know from split brain experiments done by Roger Sperry that consciousness can occur in either one hemisphere, both the linguistic competent one as well as in the other one, if they're dissociated by a corpus callosum. And we know from 150 years of clinical neurology that destruction of localized brain regions interfere with specific content of consciousness. So you can lose specific parts of cortex, and this cortex primarily, and then you lose specific content. You may be unable to see in color, you may be unable to see motion, you may feel your wife has been exchanged for an alien because you lost a feeling of familiarity. And that's all due to specific parts of the brain helping mediate specific content. So we know there is this very local association. What about attention and consciousness? So for the longest, this is an area I've been quite active in. Over the longest, for the past century, and a half or 2 centuries, most people have assumed, most scientists who study it, psychologists, that what you attend to is identical to what you're conscious of. In fact, that people say early on when I talked about consciousness, people said, well, you shouldn't really be talking about consciousness. You should really only strictly be talking about attention. And the only reason you talk about consciousness is because it gets you into the press. Already at the time with Francis, we disagreed. In the meantime, we have a lot of beautiful, by we I mean the community, a lot of beautiful, more than probably 80 different papers that have appeared over the last 6 to 7 years, including one by Nancy Cambridge here, very nicely dissociating attention, selective visual attention from visual awareness. So they're really, and I'll show you one or two, they're really different neuronal processes with distinct function. And yes, very often under laboratory conditions and possibly even in life, what you attend to is what you're conscious of. But there's lots of evidence now to indicate, and I think that's not controversial anymore among visual psychologists, that you can attend to things that are completely invisible, that you're totally unconscious of. What remains more controversial is the extent to which you can be conscious of things without attending to it. Experimentally, that's more difficult to manipulate. One big advance in this area has been the development of this technique by a student of mine, now is now a professor now. So here it's called CFS, continuous flash suppression. It works very powerfully. All right, I'll just use this pencil. So in the left eye, let's see, you have a dominant eye, that's the right eye for the sake of illustration. So in the left eye, put this constant, low contrast, angry face. Clearly a very powerful biological stimuli. In the right eye, I put these flashing mondrians. They change, let's say, at 10 hertz. Okay, what you'll see for maybe a minute or two, typically you'll just see this, and at some point you'll get the face break through. It'll be there for 2, 3, 4, 5 seconds, and then it disappears again. It's related to rivalry. It's not the same, but it's related, but it lasts much longer. Rivalry typically lasts, suppression periods are in terms of 5 to 10 seconds. This can be a minute or two. So you can now hide all sorts of things, and people have done lots and lots of variants. One of the more interesting variants involves sex, as it always does. So here you have, let's see, on the left side, you put a picture of a naked person, either man or female, and on the right side you cut her up. I mean, you cut up the picture. Okay, and then you hide it using the CFS. And then you leave this on for 8 milliseconds. So if you just ask people naively, what do you see? They tell you, oh, I just see flashing colored squares. If you're sort of a distrustful psychologist, you ask them, well, tell me, is the nude on the left or on the right? And people are a chance, 50%. And now what you do, you have an ISI, and then you put an objective test. So what you do now, you put this little faint grating here, and the grating is either oriented a little bit to the left, a little bit to the right. And your task is to say, is it oriented to the left and to the right? And you can do standard signal detection paradigm. You can get a D prime. How good are you at doing this task? And then you check how good are you doing this task when it's on the same side where the invisible nude is, or on the opposite side of the invisible nude. And then what you find, so this is done in straight people, in heterosexuals. So this is in 10 straight men and 10 straight women. This is the individual subject. This is the average. This is the D prime, so it's a measure of how well you do this task. And what you can see here that straight men perform this task significantly better at 0.01% better if the target is at the side of the invisible naked female. And they do worse if it's on the side of the invisible naked man. So in other words, their attention gets attracted to the invisible female nude, and it gets repelled by the invisible naked man. I mean, biologically, this makes perfect sense. If there's a potential naked mate out there, your brain has a mechanism to detect that. Women is the opposite. Women respond the performance increases on the side of the naked male, but they're not repelled by naked invisible female. I mean, that's the interesting thing. It's all invisible. Oh yeah, that's right. I have this paper by Nancy. So this came out a couple of years ago, where she uses the same technique. She essentially does pop out, and she studies to what extent does pop out depend on conscious seeing or not. And essentially, it's a very similar paradigm. and you do this performance at the same place where the invisible pop-out was, or you do it at opposite place. And you can also do an attentional task to show that there is this attentional allocation, that if you don't allocate it to this invisible pop-out, you cannot perform this task. So there are lots of variants of this to show that you can attend to invisible things. You don't need to see things in order to preferentially attend to them. So what some people are doing now, you really have to do a 2x2 design. So if you study whether it's in a monkey, like David Leopold has done, or in a human, or in a mouse, like we want to do at the Allen, you really need to do a 2x2 design. You need to separately manipulate selective visual attention and selective visual awareness. And so you can do that. One, you can awareness or consciousness you can do by manipulating visibility using masking or continuous flash suppression or any of the many tricks that psychologists have developed over the last 100 years. And here you use sort of attentional manipulations to independently manipulate attention. And certain things you can do without attention, without awareness, and some things depend both on attention and consciousness, and there's some that you can do in one or the other quadrant. So, but that seems to support the idea that consciousness and attention are separate processes. They are at least partially separated, if not fully separated, and the brain, they have different function, and they're subserved by different biological mechanisms. And so we're back to this dilemma that there are many things that the brain can do. Here I just list some of them, and of course you can open the pages of any psychology journal to see there's this very large number of things that we can do without being aware of them, without conscious. Francis and Crick and I call these zombie system. And so if you think about the neural correlates, you have to ask the question, where's the difference at the neuronal level between all those tasks that you can do without seeing them? So for example, we've done experiment, the Simon Thorpe experiment that many of you I know are familiar with, where you're being shown an image and you very rapidly, as quickly as you can, have to say, does it contain a face or not a face? Is it an animal, not an animal? And some of those things you can do perfectly well if they're masked, so you don't even see them, yet you still do these things above chance. And so you have to ask at the neuronal level, where's the difference between those tasks that require consciousness and those that don't? All right, and so ultimately you can come up with what we call behavioral correlates of consciousness. You can ask at the behavioral level in people, in adults, so people typically means here undergraduates, I should say, because that's the vast majority of subjects, of course. But you can also think, to what extent is it true in patients? To what extent is it true in pre-verbal children? To what extent is it true in babies? And of course, to what extent is this true in animals that you train, like mice or monkeys? So these are some of the behaviors that in people we associate with consciousness. When I ask you what did you do last night, and you tell me what you did, I assume you're conscious. In the clinic emergency room, they have these things called the coma scale. Right? They ask you certain things. Can you move your eyes? Do you know what year it is? Do you know who's the president? And things like that to assess clinical impairment. In animals, particularly in mice that I'm interested in, you can do any non-stereotyped temporal delayed sensory motor behavior, which is as a behavioral assay of consciousness. Okay, so that's on the behavior side. But now the project over the last 30 years has been to take the mind-body problem out of the domain of pure behavior and psychology and into the neuronal domain. And ultimately the aim is to look for what Francis Crick and I call the neuronal correlates of consciousness, what's also abbreviated as NCC, which is what are the minimal neuronal mechanisms that are necessary for any one conscious percept. So whether it's the yellow squares, or me feeling upset, or having a toothache, for those three different conscious sensations, there will in each case be a minimal neuronal mechanism that's necessary to give rise to that. And if I remove that mechanism by inactivating it using halorhodopsin or TMS or lesion, then this sensation will be gone. And then if I artificially activate this neural correlate by using channelrhodopsin or TMS or some other technique, the feeling should be there. Right? There should be a one-to-one correspondence at the individual trial-by-trial level. And for any such conscious percept, there will be a neural correlate of consciousness. I mean, in some sense, this is trivial. Right? Anything that the mind does, the mind, we believe, is physically supervenient upon the brain, so there has to be a brain correlate. The question is Is there something common about all those correlates? Let's see, maybe they all involve layer 5 pyramidal cells. Maybe they all involve oscillation. Maybe they all involve high degree of synchrony. Maybe they all involve activity from the anterior right insula. These are all different possibilities people have offered. Maybe they all involve a large range projection neurons in dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, a la global workspace. These are all different possibilities that people are studying. So if we think about vision, we can ask the question, so for example, is the eye, when I see you, right, is my eye, the activity of my retinal ganglion cell, to what extent is that a neural correlate of consciousness? Well, certainly right now, if you record from were you to record from my eyes, it would certainly correlate with what I see. Yet the eye itself is too different. The properties of retinal ganglion cells, the receptor field properties, is too different from my conscious perception. For instance, there's a hole in my eye, right? It's called the blind spot. It doesn't show up in my vision. There are almost no cones. There are very few color opponency cell in the periphery, yet my entire visual field looks colored. I constantly move my eyes 3 to 4 times a second, yet my percept is very stable. So from things like that, we can infer, an artist inferred this already in the 19th century, that the retina is not the place where consciousness actually happens. It's not where the neural mechanism gives rise in a causal way to consciousness. That has to be in a higher part of the brain. Furthermore, I can close my eyes and I can still imagine it. And I tend to dream a lot, and I tend to remember my dreams a lot. And so, I have very vivid, this night I was visiting this bloke in Kazakhstan. I had no idea how I knew him, but here I was in Kazakhstan. The very vivid memory of Kazakhstan. I can tell you all about it. And I had a visual memory. I mean, it was a picture in my head. But clearly, I was sleeping in the dark and my eyes were closed. So clearly, I can see things without my eyes being activated. Let's look at some other parts of the brain. So of your 86 billion neurons, 69 billion of them, more than 2/3 are in your cerebellum, the granule cells. In fact, 2 out of 3, or more than 2 out of 3 of your cells are little cells. There are four stubby little dendrites in the cerebellum. Okay? Yet if you lose them, or never had them, so this just came out, this is a patient. She was discovered recently in China. She's 24 years old. She is slightly mentally retarded, just a little bit, and she moves in a clumsy way, and she has a little bit speech impairment, but you can apparently perfectly converse with her. It took her till 6 years of age to learn how to walk and to run. And then when people scanned her, they found this. It's a complete, and they did DTI. It's a quite nice paper if you want to look it up. It's a complete absence of the cerebellum. So this is one of the few rare cases of agenesis of cerebellum. No cerebellum whatsoever. She lacks 69 billion neurons. Yet she's clearly, the doctors talk about it, she's clearly fully conversant and she can clearly talk about the internal state. So you don't apparently seem to need your cerebellum. Now, there's no such case for cortex, where you have no cortex whatsoever and you're still a conscious person. So that seems to tell us the cortex seems to be much more essential for consciousness than the cerebellum. So we have to ask from a neurological point of view, but more interesting also from a conceptual theoretical point of view, what is it about the cerebellum that it fails to give rise to conscious sensation? It has beautiful neurons, Purkinje cell, right? They're sort of the mother of all neurons, right? They're beautiful dendritic spikes and complex spikes and simple spikes and everything that pyramidal cells have, right? In glorious complexity. And there are lots of neurons and they have action potential. Everything else you want, you expect in a real brain, yet you remove it and patients don't complain of loss of consciousness. When you get a stroke or viral or gunshot there, people have ataxic, they have motor deficiency, they never complain about anything loss of consciousness. So we have to ask why. Francis Crick and I famously made this prediction in Nature article, almost 20 years ago now, where we say the neural correlates of consciousness doesn't reside in primary visual cortex. That yes, much activity, much even perceptual activity correlates with V1, but that's not where conscious sensation, visual conscious sensation arise. Lots of evidence for and against it. Let me just show you the latest one. It comes from the Logotitis Tanaka lab. It's in human fMRI, although David Leopold has done a similar experiment in monkey. So it's one of these 2x2 dissociations that I mentioned before. So across here, so this is sort of an artistic rendering of what the stimulus. Perfect. Thank you. But just remind me to give it back to you.
My whole keys.
Okay, so I better not walk off with them. So this is a sort of rendition. At the center here was always a grating, a low contrast grating that was moving, I think, left or right. And I think that at some point you had to say whether it was moving left or right. It was always there. But sometimes you saw it and sometimes you didn't see it because they did this manipulation. So sometimes you had to attend to the letters or you had to attend to the gratings. So here you manipulate the visibility, and here you manipulate whether or not you're attending here or whether you're attending there. So it's a 2x2 design. And then they look at the fMRI area in primary visual cortex that corresponds to that central area here. This is in 2 subjects. The paper was 4 subjects. So here they have the 2 traces when you have high attention with or without visibility of the central grating. And here was when you had low attention to the grating. So in other words, you attended to the periphery, whether you saw it or you didn't see it. Same thing here. So in other words, what V1 seems to care about is whether or not you attend to the central grating or you didn't attend. Whether or not you saw it here or here, these 2 curves totally overlap, didn't make any difference. Of course, this is fMRI. It's not single neurons, although David Leopold has something in single neuron. But this sort of gets at the technique that people use to try to untangle consciousness from attention or related processes. So in terms of cortex, we have pretty good evidence that it doesn't seem to involve primary visual, primary auditory, primary somatosensory cortex, that it seems to be primarily involve higher order cortex, parietal cortex, temporal cortex, and prefrontal cortex. How many people have heard about this part of the brain? Do you all know it? Okay, you should. Remember where you were when somebody mentioned the claustrum. Right? So the claustrum, as implied by its name, is a hidden structure. Okay, in us it's yay big. It's big like this. It's roughly here under the insula. You have one here and one here. You can see it in all mammals. Mice definitely have it. In fact, we have a few genes that are uniquely expressed there. And here you can see, these are pictures from Nikos Logotitis. You can see it here. It's a sheet-like structure. It's lying underneath the insula and above the basal ganglia. And it's in white matter. It's between the external and the extreme capsule. So it's embedded in the white matter. It's a thin layer of cells between, in us it's maybe between 0.5 and 2 millimeter thick, so in humans. And as I said, it's like this elongated. It's difficult. There are few patients with lesion because it gets supplied by 2 separate arteries. And if you wanted to lesion it chemically or pharmacologically, you have to do multiple injections because it's very elongated. Now, this is a recent paper, but it's known from both the rodent literature as well as the cat, as well as the monkey, as well as the human literature. So this is a fancy version of multispectral DTI. The claustrum here connects with all the different cortical areas in this very nice topographic manner. So you have a visual part of the cortex, you have a somatosensory part of the cortex, you have a motor, and you have a prefrontal part of cortex. And there are a few interesting asymmetries, like it gets input from both ipsi and contra, but only projects to ipsi. There are a few interesting things like that. So like the thalamus, it's highly interconnected to cortex, but unlike thalamus, it doesn't seem to be organized in 45 different separate nuclei, but they all seem to be a single sort of synthesium, a single tissue. So Francis Crick and I, based on this was a structure-function argument that we made, similar to the much more famous one that he made with Jim Watson. So when he first wrote about this in his book, and then later on we wrote this paper, based on so you have this unique anatomical structure in the brain, and you ask what is its function. It seems to integrate all information from the different cortical regions. So we thought at the time it was associated with consciousness. It binds all the information from the different sensory non-sensory or motor or planning areas together into one coherent percept. A little bit like the conductor of the cerebral symphony of all these different actors that play in the different visual areas, and they both project to and get input from this claustrum. So one obvious function it could subserve would be to coordinate all of them. This was in fact the very last paper that Francis worked on. In fact, 2 days before he went into the hospital in June 28, 2004, he told me not to worry, he would continue to work on the paper. Here's actually the paper, the manuscript. And when he passed away, on the day he passed away, 2 hours before Odile, his wife, told me how he was, well, in the morning he still dictated correction to this manuscript. In the afternoon, he was hallucinating a discussion with me about the claustrum, a scientist to the bitter end. Okay, so this paper appeared, and then 2005, then nothing happens for 10 years. Well, no, it's a bunch of pharmacological studies and molecular study, but then this paper came out. It's a pretty cool paper. It's a single patient, all right? So I have to warn you, it's a single patient. There are all sorts of problems with single patient, but it's an interesting anecdote that gives rise to possible experiments that one can easily do, for instance, in rodents. So here you have a patient who's an epileptic patient, and as part of the epileptic workup, you put electrodes into the brain to try to stimulate, to try to see which areas are eloquent and which areas are not eloquent. This is this is a common procedure done. And then, so typically what happens, we know this now from 120 years of direct stimulation using microstimulation of a human brain. So typically what happens, nothing happens. Typically when you stimulate at these small current, the human brain, human cortex, nothing will happen. Less frequently, the patient will have discrete sensation, will hear something, will see something. Sometimes there will be motor activity. Sometimes there will be a vague body center feelings that's very difficult to express in words. In this case, in one electrode, the patient turned sort of, the easiest way to describe it, turned into a zombie. Every time they stimulate, the patient would stare ahead, would stop for as long as the current was on, between 1 and 10 seconds. If the patient was starting doing something simple like this, the patient would stare ahead and continue to do this. If the patient said something very simple like a word, 2, 2, 2, the patient would continue to say that while staring ahead. She had no recollection of these episodes. And the electrode was just below the claustrum. So once again, it's a single patient. So it's very difficult to know what to make of it, but it's certainly challenging, and so it's interesting enough that one can learn. So here that's the location of the electrode here, just underneath the claustrum, to do further experimentation in animals. I mean, this is obviously you can't repeat this in a patient. All right. So so there are lots and lots of people who are looking for the neuronal correlates of consciousness in all sorts of different, typically cortical structures. Of course, we have to ask, what about consciousness in other mammals? So here you see 2 female mammals, my daughter and her guard dog, her beloved German Shepherd, Tosca. Now we think, not only because I'm very fond of dogs, but we think, or biologists at least believe, that certainly all mammals share most essential things except language with human. And we say that because their brains are very similar. If I give you a little cubic millimeter of human cortex, of dog cortex, of mouse cortex, only an expert armed with a microscope can really tell them apart. The genes are roughly the same, the neurons are roughly the same, the layering is roughly the same. It's all basically the same. It's just more of it in us. We have roughly 1,000 times more than a mouse, and it's thicker. Of course, we don't have the biggest brain that's given to elephants and other structures. So for reasons of evolutionary and structural continuity, I think there's no reason to deny that certainly animals like dogs, can be happy and can be sad. And if you're around a cat, there's no question about it, can be lonely. It can have other states that we have, maybe less complex, but certainly also share the gifts of consciousness with us. Right now, experimentally, it's very difficult to address the question to what extent this is true of animals that are very different from us. For instance, cephalopods that are very complex, that have imitation learning and other very complicated ways, or bees that have the dance, that have very complicated behaviors, whose brain, I'd like to remind you, the mushroom body, has a circuit density 10 times higher than the density of cortex. It's very difficult right now to know to what extent does a bee actually feel something when it's laden with nectar in the golden sun? We don't know. With mammals, it's easier to do because you can do tests that are very similar to the tests we can do in humans. But ultimately, you're left with a number of hard questions that without a theory, you cannot really address. And that's what I want to talk in the second part. So if it's true that the claustrum is involved, let's just pause at that. We really want to have a deep theoretical reason why the claustrum. Why not the thalamus? Why the claustrum? Why not some other structure? Why not the cerebellum? I was just telling you empirically the cerebellum does not seem to be involved in consciousness. Well, why? It's curious. They have lots of neurons and everything else. Why is it not involved in consciousness? What theoretical reasons? Why not afferent pathways? Why not cortex during deep sleep, right? If you record from a single neuron in a sleeping animal, it's not that easy to say, is it a sleeping or not? What's different? Why in deep sleep does it not give rise to consciousness? If you think synchrony is important, well, then your brain is highly synchronized during a grand mal seizure, but of course that's when we lose consciousness. So why is that? Then there are more hard questions that are very difficult to answer without a theory. You have a patient like this is one of Nick Schiff's patients, right, who is an isolated, everything is dysfunctional except this isolated island of cortical activity. And he says one thing, and he says it again and again and again. He says, oh shit, oh shit, oh shit, that's what he says, 8 hours a day. You know, it's like a tape recorder stuck. Well, is this person experienced something a little bit maybe? Right now, very difficult to answer. What about pre-linguistic children, either a newborn infant, all right, or a preterm infant like this, what is it, 28-week-old infant? Or what about a fetus? At what point does a fetus make a transition, if ever, between feeling nothing, being alive clearly, but not feeling anything, like we do in deep sleep, and at what point does a fetus feel something? Right now we have heated arguments involving abortion and other things based on legal and political reasons, but we really don't know from a scientific point of view how to answer this question. What about anesthesia? For example, ketamine anesthesia, when your brain is highly active. And of course, there are lots of cases of awareness under anesthesia. What about sleepwalking? When you have an individual that with open eyes can do complicated things, including driving and all sorts of other things, to what extent is this person conscious or not? As I mentioned, what about animals that are very different from us, that don't have a cerebral cortex and a thalamus, but have a very different structure, but are capable of highly sophisticated behavior like an octopus or bee or fly or C. elegans? And then lastly, what about things like this? Right? We live now in a world where more and more, in particular here at MIT and in the center, we're confronted with creatures that if human were to exhibit those abilities, nobody would doubt that they would be conscious. If you have a severely brain-injured patient and she can play chess, or she can play Jeopardy, or she can drive car, right, all of which things computers can do, there would be no question in anybody's mind that this person is fully conscious. So a basis of what reason do we deny or not deny these guys, a more advanced version of Siri, let's say. Remember her, the movie, her, Samantha, right? How do we know? We need a theory that tells us whether Samantha is actually conscious or whether she's not conscious. Right now, we don't have such a theory. So what's really beyond studying the behavioral correlates and the neuronal correlates of consciousness, which is what I do, and what lots of other labs now do, we need a theory that tells us, in principle, when is a system conscious? Is this one conscious? And I want a rigorous theory, rigorous explanation for why it is or why it's not conscious. What about these? What about these? All right, so we need a theory that takes us from conscious experience, to mechanisms, and to the brain. This, incidentally, also bypasses the hard problem that Leibniz first talks about in his famous example about when he walks inside the mill, and more recently, William James, of course, and then more recently, David Chalmers talks about. Right? It is probably true that trying to take a brain and sort of wring consciousness out of it is probably truly a hard problem. Although one has to be extremely skeptical when philosophers say something is hard and science can't do it. Historically, they don't have a very good track record, I think, of predicting things. But I think it's much easier if we start where I think any investigation of the world has to start, namely with the most central fact of our existence, my own feelings, my own phenomenology. All right, so now I'll come to the theory of Giulio Tononi, who's a psychiatrist and a neuroscientist, a very good friend and a close colleague. Disclosure here, we've published many papers together at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, who has this integrated information theory that he's worked on with many people, but it's really his theory. And there are various versions of it, and so for the latest, I urge you, if you're interested, go to this PLOS computational biology paper. So here, just like in modern mathematics, you start out an axiomatic approach. So the idea is that you formulate 5 axioms based on your phenomenological experience, the experience of how the world appears to you. These axioms should do what any other axiomatic system do. They should be independent. They should not be derivable from each other. And then together they should describe everything that there is to describe about the phenomena. And then from these axioms, you go towards a calculus that implements these axioms, the meat of the theory. And then you test this integrated information theory on various, and I'll show you tests that you can do in the clinic and that you can do in animals and in people. All right, so there are 5 axioms here. The axioms themselves, I think, are relatively straightforward to understand. The first axiom is the axioms of existence, right? In order for anything to exist, it has to make a difference. This is also known as Alexander's dictum. If nothing makes a difference to you and you don't make any difference to anything, then you may as well not exist. Well, I mean, I remind you in physics this principle is used. For example, in the discussion of ether, the physicists certainly know the ether was this notion that was used around 1900. It fills the space, it's infinite rigid, yet it's also infinite flexible. Right? It had to explain a number of discerning facts about the cosmos at large. Then Einstein didn't need the ether anymore to explain anything. Now, the ether could still exist, but it has no causal connection. It doesn't make any difference. Nothing makes a difference to it. It doesn't make a difference, so therefore physicists don't talk about it anymore. So I think it's a deep principle that we use whether we know it or not. So the axiom of existence says experience exists intrinsically. This is very important, not observer dependent. My conscience exists totally independent of anything else in the world. It doesn't depend on a brain looking down at me. It doesn't depend on anything else looking down at me. It just exists intrinsically. B, experience is structured. It has many aspects. So this is a famous drawing from Ernst Mach. If you see actually what it is, it's him. He tried to describe what he sees looking out of his one eye, right? So here you can see his mustache, the bridge of his nose, and he looks out at the world. And the world has all sorts of elements, right? It has objects in it, it has left, it has right, it is up, it is down. It's incredibly rich. There are all these concepts in it. It's next to each other. So the books are to the right of the window, which is above the floor, etc. So each conscious perception is very rich. Which brings me to this next axiom, the third axiom. Each experience is the way it is because it differentiated from a gazillion other possible percepts you can have. So if you go back to the scholastic, they actually thought a lot about this. Some of them are, I think, really better than the analytic philosophers. They call this the essence. That's Zosine, for example, some of them, people like Albertus Magnus, that experience is differentiated from one out of many, right? If you imagine everything I see right now out of my left eye, and you imagine I see this one unique thing that I'll never see again in the history of the universe, compared to everything else I could see, every movie, every frame of every movie that's ever been made or will ever be made in the history of the universe, right? Plus all smells and all taste and all emotional experience. So it's incredibly rich what you see, both what you see and what you not see. Even if you wake up disoriented, you jet lagged, you traveled 9 hours, you wake up 3 in the morning in your hotel room, all you know it's black, right? But that black it's not just a simple one bit, because that black is different from anything else that you might see that you have ever seen. So even that black is incredibly rich to differentiate it from all other possible experiences. Next, so philosophers have much remarked upon this. They call it holistic or integrated. Each experience is highly integrated. It is one. So for example, you don't see the left room separate from the right room. You don't see, I mean, of course you can do this, but then you're seeing different things. Whatever I apprehend as one. It's a unitary, integrated, holistic percept. It's just like when I look at, for instance, the word honeymoon. I don't see honey and moon and then I see a higher order honeymoon. I just see it as honeymoon. You know what people do once they get married. All right, and lastly, experience is unique. At any one point in time, I only see one thing. I'm not a superposition, unlike in quantum mechanics. I'm not a superposition of different conscious percepts. The Christof, right? The my narrative self, the one that looks out at the world and sees all of you, that sees this in a movie, that there's only one experience, and not different experience in my left brain and my right brain, unless I'm dissociated in a dissociative state, that sometimes happens, or a split brain patient or something else. But in the normal brain, it's integrated. I have one experience. It's at one level of granularity, whatever that may be, neurons or subneurons or supraneurons or columns. It's at one time scale. It doesn't flow at infinite many time scale, and I'm a superposition of any. I'm only one. All right, so now we move, so now it gets a little bit tricky, and because now we have to move from the axioms to the postulate. I mean, it's all nice having these axioms, and most people find a lot in these axioms that resonates, although some people say, well, maybe we need to postulate an additional axiom, maybe not, maybe yes, maybe no, but the bigger challenge is to move to mechanisms, because we are scientists, we're not just philosophers, so it's not just okay to speculate, but you want to speculate, but in a realm where you can ultimately make predictions about what is and what is not conscious, and where you can make predictions about neural correlates and whether machines ever will be or won't be conscious. So the existence, the first axiom, says, well, and this is in some sense the most difficult one to get across, that experience, you have a mechanism, like the brain, or a set of transistor gates. And they're in a particular state, so some neurons are firing, some neurons are not firing here. So we do everything because it's actually very difficult to compute things with IoT, because it very quickly explodes in terms of the number of possibilities you have to compute. We have this simple gate here, 3 or 5 neurons. 3 of them, it's an XOR neuron, an OR, and an and they're either on or off. Here they're off, and yellow means they're on. Okay, so here you have these these gates, if you want, and some of them are on and some are off. All right. Now, what's really important is that experience is generated not only by a set of mechanisms in a particular state, like a brain where some neurons fire and some neurons don't fire, but also it has a cause-effect repertoire. And I'll come back what that means in a couple of slides in terms of causation. Because this state has to come from somewhere and it's going to go somewhere. Remember, I said you can only exist if you make a difference. In this case, because consciousness is not dependent on an external observer, it has to you only exist if you make a difference to yourself. In other words, you have to have some cause within your system that caused you, and you have to have you have to be able to cause things within your system. So in this case, when you're in this state, so this is off, and this is on. So here are the 3 neurons corresponding to A, B, and C. You can say, well, given I find myself in this state, these are the various states I could have come from just in the past, assuming this is a discrete system, and these are the different states I could go to, given in this state. So it has a path, it has a cause repertoire. It was caused by some of these states with this probability, and so I could have come from these different states, and it has possible different ways to go into the future, depending on my input here. And so, for example, if I were to do an experiment where by halo or channel rhodopsin I eliminate some of these, then this is going to change. The consciousness of the subject, of this observer, is going to change in a predictable way, even though I may not change the state. I'll come back to that in a second. All right, so experience is generated by any mechanism that has a cause-effect repertoire in a particular state. So composition. So experience is structured with many aspects. Well, so in this case, there are many subcomponents. Right, so I can look at the entire system as a whole, or I can look at each of the subcomponents. I can look at these two, this tuplet, this end tuplet. I can look at that neuron and this neuron, and so in principle I have to look at the power set of all of these different mechanisms. Experience is differentiated. It can be one out of many. So it is what it is because it differs in particular ways from all the other experiences. So in this way, you have so once again you have this mechanisms, and you have all these different subcomponents, and each one of them comes from has a particular cause repertoire and a particular effect repertoire. And you can, so ultimately this structure lives in a space that has a so-called qualia space that has as many dimensions as the dimension you have in your past and in your future. So here you have 3 neurons, so in principle you have 8 states in the past and you have 8 states in the future. So in principle this structure lives in a 16-dimensional space. it has to be integrated. Experience is unified. So here you compute a measure of how integrated this the system is by essentially computing the difference between different forms of, if you want, entropy, using something like Kullback-Leibler, or here they actually use a metric, distant measure called the EMD, the Earth mover distance. So it's, essentially it says you look at all these different states from all the different elementary mechanisms, and then you look at to what extent do they exist. To what extent could they exist and by themselves? So if you have a system like a split brain that consists out of two independent brains, then the joint entropy is just the probability of it's just a product of the individual entropies. So in that sense, the system says this system doesn't have its own autonomous existence. You only exist if you're irreducible. If you're irreducible to a simpler system, then you don't exist. Only the simpler system exists. So here you compute to what extent the system is irreducible by essentially looking at all possible cuts, all possible bipartition, all possible tripartition. So this is where the theory gets practically very difficult to compute. And you look at the one that sort of minimizes that minimizes the information exchange between the different partitions. So if you had a system like a brain that was split, that was cut by the surgeon, you essentially have two independent systems. They exist, but there isn't anything like to be a brain as a whole because it doesn't exist at its own level. Only the subcomponent exists. And lastly, you say exclusion. So you only pick, in any given system, you only pick the one system, the one that maximizes this irreducibility, this number called phi. So this is what phi is about. So phi, in some sense, is a measure of to the extent to which a system is irreducible. You look at all possible subsystems, at all possible levels of granularity. So you can look at small granules and at high granules. You can look at different spatial granularity, different temporal granularity, and it's like a maximum principle extreme in physics. You pick the one that maximizes it, and it's a system that's currently that is the one that has consciousness associated with it. And then you come to the central identity of the theory that essentially says if you have a mechanism in a particular state with a particular cause-effect repertoire, the central identity posits that the structure of the system in this high-dimensional qualia space, this space spanned by all the different states it could take in the past and it could take in the future, depending on where you are right now, that space is what experience is. So in a sense, it's the Pythagorean program run to its completion, because ultimately it says what experience is this mathematical structure, this entope in this very high-dimensional space. And there are two things associated with it. There's the structure itself associated with it that gives you the quality of that structure. So whether you're seeing red, or it's the agony of a cancer patient, or it's the dream of a lotus eater, all are what they are. All are experiences in these trillion-dimensional spaces. That's what they are. That's what the quiddity of experience is. The voice inside your head, the picture inside your skull, they are what they are because of this mathematical structure. And the quantity of the structure is measured by this number called phi. And so the theory says there's this main complex. So if you look at a system, there's a main complex, the component that's most irreducible, that has the highest phi, and that is currently what it is, the neural correlate of consciousness, to switch over to the language now of neurology. Now, I know there's no way in hell that you can convey the complexity of this theory in 10 minutes. So right now, let's just go with that. There's all the mathematics. You can ask me a question afterwards. All the mathematics is spelled out in the papers. It makes a number of predictions, some of which are compatible with this very ancient philosophical belief called panpsychism. So panpsychism, I first encountered it at undergrad in Plato, of course. It's been prevalent. It's been a sort of a theme among Western philosophers, including Schopenhauer. Strawson is probably the contemporary philosopher most closely associated with that. And then, of course, in the Dalai Lama and many, it's a very powerful part of Buddhism. But there are also certain things where the theory makes very strikingly different predictions, particularly when it comes to computers. So the theory says the system consciousness can be graded. So you have a system like this. It has 3 times 5 neurons, 50 neurons. I mean, quote neurons. These are simple switches. And here what you do, they're interconnected in this way, and you can now compute phi, the theory, whether you think it's relevant or not, whether it explains consciousness or not, it's a well-defined theory that takes any mechanism like this in a particular state and assigns a number to it. All right, so in this case, the number is 10, it's a dimensionless number. In this world, it's not a bits, it's 10.56. It tells you how irreducible the system is. In some sense, how much does this system exist? The larger the number, the more irreducible the system is, and in some sense, in some real ontological sense, the more it exists. Now you add noise to these connections. All you do, you leave all the connection there, but you add more and more noise to it. And then you can see sort of the overall phi goes down. There's less integration now because you've injected sort of entropy into the system. You can also compute the phi of these little guys because, once again, in principle, you compute phi with all possible configuration of elements, and you pick the one that's maximum. So here, these little guys still have very low phi, lower than the whole. But then you've added now so much noise that suddenly the system disintegrates, and now it disintegrates into 5 separate conscious systems, each of which is separate conscious at a very low level, because the whole now, because of all the noise, these numbers are switched around, should be the other way. That and the little guys have now more phi and then the big guys. So it says that consciousness is graded. This, of course, reflects our own experience in our lifetime and day to day. Your consciousness waxes and wanes, right? When you're a baby, it's different than when you're a fully grown adult, or even as a teenager, you don't have a lot of insight into your own behavior. You do certain things you don't know why, and of course, if you become old and demented, then your consciousness goes down. And even during the day, when you've well slept, or when you haven't slept in a day or two, or you're totally hungover, your consciousness can wax and wane. So this theory very much reflects that consciousness is graded. It's not an all or none thing. Very interesting prediction. This theory predicts that any feed-forward system has phi 0. The reason is essentially the system has to, as I said, the first axiom of existence says the system has to make a difference to itself. In other words, it has to feed back to itself and has to get input from itself. A strictly feed-forward system does not do this. Now, you can, of course, interesting, if you look at machine learning algorithms, you look at standard convolutional nets, they all feed forward. So what the theory says, yes, you can have a complicated neural network that does complicated things like detects whether there's a cat present or a face present. It can do all sorts of things, anything that you can do with standard machine learning. Yet this system will not be conscious because it doesn't have the right cause-effect structure. It doesn't have the right causal structure. So this also means there isn't any Turing test because there can be, of course, Turing tests for intelligence, but Turing tests for consciousness doesn't work. It's not an input-output manipulation. It's not that you manipulate the input and you look at the output, because you can clearly do that for a strictly feed-forward network. And the theory, whether you believe the theory relates to consciousness or not, it's a different matter, but the theory quite clearly says phi associated with any sort of feed-forward networks will be 0. Which also means you can have 2 separate networks. You can now have a complicated heavy feedback network. And of course, that's an equivalent for a finite amount of time step. You can, for any complicated feedback network, you can unfold it and turn it into a much more complicated, purely feed-forward network. So both systems will do exactly the same thing. They're isomorphic in terms of input-output behavior. That one, because of its causal structure, so the theory says will be conscious, the other one not. So let's look at some experimental predictions. So the neural correlates of consciousness are identical to the main complex, the one that maximizes phi in a particular state with its own particular cause-effect repertoire. I emphasize that because of some experiments that we can begin to do now. So first of all, there was this paper that from the Tononi lab 10 years ago called Zap and Zip. So what they did, they take volunteers and sleep deprive them for a day. So these are healthy undergraduates, sleep deprive them, so then they can sleep in a lab equipped with 128 EEG channels and with a TMS device. And you do the TMS device, you go to subthreshold doses so the person doesn't wake up. And then essentially you sort of tap the brain. And then you look at, in terms of the EEG, the reverberation, you do Loretta or something, it's an EEG source localization device, and then you just compute the complexity of the resultant brain wave. Think of it a little bit as like you have a bell, like the Liberty Bell, and you ring it with a hammer, and then you can hear it resonate. And if it's really good, it resonates for a long time. Right, that's a sort of metaphor. So here you have, this is in awake. The time scale here, this is like, I don't know, 300 milliseconds or something. You give this the TMS pulse here, and then you can see this reverberation. So you do it here over the precuneus, and then you can see it goes to the travels contralateral, it reverberates around cortex. And here, if you do the underlying source localization. So it's well, by some measure, it's well integrated. It's what cortex does. So what they're trying to do is they're trying to derive a simple empirical measure that you can use in the clinic to measure whether a patient in front of you who may be severely impaired and is unable to speak is actually conscious or not. So in this paper, they did this for wake, and then they did this for deep sleep. So if you have subjects that are now in deep sleep, you get a response locally that's in fact even bigger, right? Depending on up-down states, etc. But then it's structured, the complexity is much less, and it very quickly stops. It doesn't really travel nearly as far. The brain is much more disconnected. What they can now do, they've done this in a large clinical study of 100 subjects or so, patients in Italy, and they're now trying it at a bunch of different clinics. What they're doing now is at the single subject level, not at the group level, because for it to be clinical useful device, you need to have it at the level of individual people. You do this in normal subjects, wake and sleep. You do it in volunteer anesthesiologists that become anesthetized using 3 different types of anesthesia to try to test what does this measure do in anesthesia. You do it in persistent vegetative state, you do it in vegetative state, you do it in minimal conscious state, and you do it in locked-in syndrome. When we know from the clinic, for example, locked-in syndrome, these people are conscious. Minimal conscious state, they can be sometimes conscious. Persistent vegetative state, they don't appear to be conscious. So what you can do, they essentially they zap a cortex, then they get this underlying cortical activity pattern, then they compress it using Lempel-Ziv. So they call it zap and zip method, to get a single number. So this methods end up with one number, the PCI, perturbational complexity index. And it's a scalar number, and if it's high, the patients tend to be conscious. These are the conscious subjects. And if it's low, due to other clinical measure, we know the patient isn't conscious. So it very nicely segregates. It didn't work in 2 patients, 2 severely impaired patients. In both of them, it predicted they would be conscious. And indeed, 2 days later, quote, they woke up using other clinical criteria. So they shifted from a vegetative state when people are non-responsive to spoken commands or other things, they switch into a minimal conscious state. So that's pretty cool. That's really very exciting, because it could be for the first time that you have a clinical useful device that tells you, is this patient in front of me actually conscious or not? And in the US alone, there are roughly 10,000 people in these states, like a persistent vegetative state. You may remember, I mean, some of you will remember Terry Schiavo. So she was an example of that. All right, so you can try to explain some of these. Yeah, so most famously, why is the cerebellum not involved in consciousness? Well, the main hypothesis is, if you look at very simple computer modeling of networks and connectivity with respect to phi, cerebellum is really organized as a bunch of 2-dimensional sheets, right? You have the Purkinje cells and you have the parallel fibers. So it doesn't have a 3-dimensional network connectivity in the sense that, for example, cortex has, which is heavily interconnected and has a small world connectivity. So if you have very regular, almost crystalline-like array of these 2-dimensional slabs, you get a very low phi, compared to having a cortex where you have heterogeneous elements of different cell types that are interconnected in a small world connectivity. You get much easier very high values of phi. Okay, let's to come to an end here. Let's look at some cool predictions. All right, so let's do this. Now we're thinking about channel rhodopsin here and halo in humans. Right? But you can do this in mice and in monkeys also. So first of all, you're looking at a gray apple, right? And you have, let's say, activity in your favorite color area. Let's say down here V4, and it goes up to LIP because it combines with the spatial information. Let's say and you see you're conscious of a gray apple, and you say gray apple. All right. So now you make this. You make the following experiment. You put into the terminals of these neurons here, well, you inject them with halo, Right? So the halo is expressed throughout the neurons, particularly in the synaptic terminals. So now you shine green light on them and you turn off the synaptic terminals. So nothing changes. This is counterintuitive because nothing changes in activity here. In both cases, neurons in, let's say, your color area are not firing. Right? Both here and here. So if I just look at the neurons firing, I see, okay, both cases the neurons are not firing. So I guess in both cases you'll say the apple is gray. But here they're not firing. They could have fired, but they didn't fire because there wasn't any color, naively spoken, in it. Here they're not firing because they've been blocked. They've been prevented by my experimental manipulation. Right? So in this situation, here I've reduced the cause-effect repertoire. I've dramatically eliminated the effect here. These neurons, although they still fire, cannot have any effect more downstream. And the theory says, quite clearly makes a prediction, that although the firing is the same, here the consciousness will be different. Here you probably get something closer to anosognosia. So you get what people call anosognosia with achromatopsia. In other words, the patient will say, well, I don't see any color. It's not that I see gray, because gray is a color, of course, but I see nothing. Or he'll say, well, I know apples are red, so therefore they're probably red. And there are patients like this. So what's counterintuitive here, and I'll show you a second case, what's counterintuitive here to most physiologists, that in both cases neurons are not firing, but yet you get a different state. Now this doesn't violate physicalism. IIT is here the mental is totally supervenient to the physical, but the difference is here, if you want, your synaptic output weights are set to 0 by my experimental manipulation. And what this also shows you that it's not about sending spikes to somewhere. It's not that consciousness isn't a message that's being passed sort of along here with a spike. It's a difference the system makes to itself. And here it cannot make, or the ability for the system to make a difference to itself has been dramatically reduced by your experimental manipulation. Here's a second experiment. In fact, Dan Dennett talks about it, the perfect experiment. It's actually not. It's quite imperfect. But so here you have sort of the opposite case. You have a red have a red apple, and now your neurons here are firing, and their firing symbolizes red. Okay, and you go over here, and you're conscious of red, and I see a red apple. Now you do the same manipulation. You introduce a halo into these neurons here. So what halo does, of course, when you shine the right light on it, it activates a chloride shunt and, well, a pump, and effectively it shunts out. So those neurons here cannot influence the postsynaptic target anymore. Those neurons are just firing just as much as here. But the theory says in this case, once again, you'll see, sorry, I should have changed it. You will not see anything. You will. Again, you'll get the same symptoms of seeing no color, anosognosia, achromatopsia, while here you see the color, the red. So it's a principle in prediction you can test either by this or using other ways of TMS. It's a little bit like the story of Sherlock Holmes in Silver Blazes. Remember when Sherlock Holmes, when the inspector, who's as usual clueless, Lestrade asks, well, what's the critical clue? And Sherlock Holmes says, the dog. And then Lestrade says, why the dog? Sherlock Holmes says, well, the dog didn't bark at night. That's a critical clue. Well, of course, what that revealed to Sherlock Holmes was the dog didn't bark at night because the intruder was known to the dog, right? The dog could have barked, but didn't bark, which is different than if you had a dog that was poisoned, for instance, because then he couldn't have barked. Then the meaning of the silent dog would have been quite different. So the important point here is to say that consciousness is not in the sort of sending of message. It's what the difference the system makes by generating spikes to itself. All right, let me come to an end here. So I guess a question, particularly here at the Center for Intelligence, is, so what difference does consciousness make? How could it be could it have been evolutionary selected? So under this view, under this reading, consciousness is a property intrinsic to organized matter. It's a property like charge and spin. Right? We find ourselves in a universe that has space and time and mass and energy, but we also find ourselves in a universe where organized systems that have phi different from 0 have experience. It's just the way it is. We can ask, could we imagine another universe? I could. I mean, I can also imagine physicists occupied with the thought, can you imagine a universe in which quantum mechanics doesn't hold? Maybe yes, maybe no. So a priori, no physicist goes around and says, well, what's the function of charge or mass? It just is. We live in a universe where certain things have a positive or negative charge. But now we find ourselves in a universe where we have highly conscious creatures. So the question is, how are we selected for? And the answer is integrated information is evolutionarily advantageous, since obviously it's much better rather than having separate streams of information, let's say auditory and visual and memory. It's obviously much better if you can integrate that information, because then you're much more easily able to find coincidences and make informational judgment on the whole. You can show that in simple evolution, so I'm not going to go in great depth here. We have sort of simple creatures that have a genome. We do sort of artificial evolution. These are like Breitenberg vehicles, except they have a genome, and early on they don't know anything. They have 3 visual sensors, a side door sensor, a 1-bit memory, no memory here, and then motor. They can move left, move right, or move straight ahead. And you put them down here and you send them through these mazes, and you select them over 60,000 generations. You select the top 10% in terms of how far have they gotten through the labyrinth, and you select the best ones. You mutate them using various point mutation. You send them again, and you do this over and over again. And then what you can see, if you do this for long enough, you of course get the animals, they adapt to their environment using our particular selection function. You can see this nicely relationship between the minimal phi. So this is there's a lot of redundancy here. So this shows you how adapted they are. 100% is the person who does the optimal at every single point in the labyrinth and makes the optimal decision. And so you can see there's this nice relationship between how adapted the animates are and the measure of integration between the minimal phi, because there is a large degree of redundancy. So this is a simple toy experiment, and you can make more of them to show why it pays for an organism to be highly integrated. So this would suggest the driver for why we are high conscious creatures, is that it makes us much more effective at taking decisions. Now lastly, particularly here in a school like MIT, let me come to the point that's probably most controversial and that many of you are going to reject. Which systems are not conscious, or which systems are only minimal conscious? So first of all, IIT solves a long-standing problem with consciousness that Leibniz talks about and that William James talks about, namely the problem of aggregate. John Searles also talks about it. Namely, so there are 100 people in this room. Is there a superconsciousness? Is there an Übermind? Right? Many people believe that. Well, there's not, and the theory says it's not, because it's a maximum over all grains, over all spatial temporal scales. So the idea would be there's a local maximum here, and there's a local maximum here within Tommy's brain, but there's no there's no Christof/Tommy. Now what you could do interesting thought experiments that may be possible in the future. You can, for example, connect my brain and Tommy's brain with some sort of a direct brain-to-brain transfer where I enhance the bandwidth between our brain. At some point, abruptly, what the theory says, at some point our brains will become so interconnected that the phi of us two as a whole is going to exceed the phi of each one of us. At that point, abruptly, my consciousness and his consciousness will disappear, and there will be this new Übermind, but it requires a causal mechanism. And likewise, if you turn it back, so you can think about the opposite experiment. You take a normal brain, you slowly, axon by axon, poison or block the corpus callosum, the 200 million fibers that connect the left and the right brain. What the theory says that you have a single integrated consciousness, but as you block more and more, at some point, the local phi will exceed the phi of the whole. At that point, the big phi will abruptly disappear because of the fifth axiom of exclusivity. You pick the maximum one, and you will have two consciousnesses that appear. Feed-forward systems have no phi. And most interestingly, if you think about computer simulations of brain, so let's say we think of Henry Markham's system. Right, so let's fast forward 50 years from now, and we have a perfect computer model that has all the dendrites and all the synapses and all the NMDA spikes and calcium channels and potassium channels and genes and whatnot that's involved in consciousness. And this computer reproduces my behavior, both input-output as well as at the causal level. And people would say, well, clearly it's conscious. And no, the theory says, no, you have to look at actually not what it's simulating, but you have to look at its causal effect power at the relevant hardware level. The relevant hardware level is the level of the CPU. And so now you have to actually look at the causal effect structure of individual transistors. And we know a lot about them because we build them. And so we know, for example, on the ALU part, typically one transistor talks to 3 to 5 other transistors. Gets input from 3 to 5, talks to 3 to 5 other in the logical part of it. So its causal effect power is very, very simple. It's very much reduced. And so the theory says very clearly, this thing will not be conscious. This computer simulation, although it replicates all the behavior. So this really argues against argues against functionalism. Although the behavior is the same, even at the level of simulated neurons, the underlying causal effect repertoire is not. It is similar to saying when I simulate a black hole, right? I can do that in great detail. Space-time we know the property of mass, it bends space-time. Well, space-time in this computer simulation will never bend the computer, right? Just like weather simulation, it will never get actually wet inside the computer. Right? Well, this is the same thing. You can simulate it, but simulation is not the same. So you have a simulated input-output, but the machine itself will not be conscious. In order to create a conscious being, it doesn't require magic. It requires you to replicate the actual causal effect structure. So you want to do it neuromorphically. Right? You actually want to replicate the bilipid membrane, the synapses, the large fan-in, fan-out in copper or wire or light or whatever. You have to do that, not emulate it, but actually build it. Not simulate, but actually build it. Then you would get human-level consciousness. All right. So of these systems, only the upper left one would be conscious. All right, so I think... So this is the way we know the world, right? I only know the world because I'm this flame. That's how I experience the world. And that's the only thing I know about the world. And of course, we know objectively speaking, the world is more like this. There are many, many flames of other people and other conscious entities. And I think it's not any final theory, but I think it's by far the best theory that has been out there 20 years. It makes a nice prediction. It's computationally. It makes prediction about the neural correlates. It's axiomatic as anything you want about a scientific theory. In particular, it's predictive power in non-intuitive places, just like Einstein's theory early on predicted things like black holes, which are totally non-intuitive. Finally, they were borne out by this. So yes, the theory makes a number of predictions that you can find consciousness in very unusual places, maybe in very small animals, and you may not find it in places where you think it is. Thank you very much.